Well, I had the good fortune of having a neutral interlocutor to sort of have some discussion with in terms of identity consciousness, or social justice on the topic of systemic racism, and so at least I've probably coalesced some of my thoughts in a more presentable form. So I'm going to go through the different components of what I would describe as the fundamental error within the critique or criticism of what is sort of roughly described as systemic oppression or systemic racism. Uh, yeah, so in some sense, yeah, I don't want to make too many concessions to begin with before getting into the details, because then it doesn't sort of the concessions that I make might otherwise be confusing or confuse the issue a bit too much. But there is something in what is taken into account uh, within systemic racism that does need to be addressed. But how it's formulated and sort of tracked within theories of criticism of racism in this context, it's fundamentally problematic and counterproductive, and it facilitates corruption. Is the basic thing, but it also does so on a much more pervasive and pure. It's really toxic ideology. Fundamentally breeds fascistic values and very strange forms of reducing issues. It really it creates racism. I mean, is the irony really? It is the vast engine and manufacturer of racism. It is what Hitler would have called um, the useful idiot ideology, effectively. But okay, so let me get into the component part. So the biggest problem with arguments that contend systemic oppression uh, is that they're not philosophically constructed, and so they can't really be intellectually challenged. So fundamentally, you have a real problem because you can't really deprogram people that believe in this stuff, because it's a belief structure that really conceals its own axioms and premises, and it sort of makes these assertions that it runs on, and many of those assertions practically just facilitate the insulation of the belief structure, um, and these are just taken to be historical facts. It is just sort of um, yeah. So the point of contact in terms of dissecting it is somewhat problematic. At least when you're talking to a proponent of identity consciousness, it's almost impossible. Generally, what comes out is people just sort of abjectly rely on historical narrative in some sense, which is the historical account that is the inverted commas cause, that the effect is the present, uh, the effect of which being the present, which therefore means that the historical account is what must be um, revoked and undone. Now, this this is going to sound somewhat convoluted. Um, it's better to arrive at this after going through the issues in a slightly different order, perhaps. But what I'm basically going to make out is that there are two kinds of causes of a disadvantage, which is what we should really be concerned with in terms of healing a situation or causing a remedy, or being the cause of remedy or resolution, is that the cause of a disadvantage can either be a historical description, or it can be in the persistence of that disadvantage, which could be described as, or defined as, depending on how you choose to define it, as the non-application of the solution to the disadvantage. So basically, the cause of a disadvantage can be a historical account, or it can be that a solution has not been found. That could be said to be a separate cause. And that really has to do with your perspective as, do you believe that cause itself is bound to determinism in history, which is, I would say, effectively built into the belief system of identity consciousness, which really has to do with the loss of agency, is that you are conditioned by the system. And okay, let me elaborate on that, because that's probably going to be more important than just finishing that small point, which might seem too neat and clean cut. But basically, if you can have the discipline of just focusing on, well, what is the solution for this disadvantage, then that completely reorders your frame of thinking, rather than trying to undo history and challenge history, which becomes a completely, I mean, that's already an abstract sort of conception of progress to begin with. It's somewhat fundamentally fraught with, vagaries at the very least. And if you're going to be stuck with that, then you have to save something called identity rather than actual people that are suffering from actual disadvantages. And when identity becomes your recipient of some kind of benefit or redemption, then you really have a whole host of problems of tokenism, all this kind of representation politics that comes into it, which there are other ways of describing these problems. But basically, if you can just imagine that you've just got people, and you've got these grey shaded shaded circles that you're drawing on top of people to kind of group them in to entities that, like in that shaded line that makes that circle, there's a big marginal area in which some people are sort of being intersected by that circle, and then you've got whatever is not in the shaded area but sits squarely inside that circle. Well, that's a stereotype. The stereotype lives clearly inside of it, and that kernel, that stereotypical kernel, everything makes sense to those players, to whatever can represent what's clearly inside the circle. But if everyone is sort of intersected on some kind of, the shaded area, then we're in big trouble. And that is the fundamental deluge that identity politics eventually generates, which is, and in order to escape that problem, effectively you end up having a state that endorses a single identity. Because if you don't serve one master, there's no way to kind of keep the narrative coherent. And that narrative is the historical account, which... and the reason why the historical account is so important, and why it becomes the sort of the fuel for a mythology that centers the identity, that grounds the entity as deserving of a distinct moral consideration, that binding factor that generates the distinct moral consideration, is that it is it is correlated directly to a conditioning that is felt in the present. And as much as those things are taken to be a kind of an ideological equivalency of each other, you've got a causal narrative, which then you can uh, you can endorse that binding factor, you can promote the identity at the set, and which fundamentally then simultaneously is taken to counteract the conditioning. And what gets left in all of this is where are the people on the ground and what's happening to their disadvantages, because that doesn't quite actually fit into this ideological formulation is all you can call it. So another way of seeing where these problems start to arise is when, if we can take the definition of racism to be arbitrary discrimination that is linked to race, but but if we take systemic racism to be arbitrary discrimination perpetrated by a system, that's fundamentally problematic, as because, I mean, other than having direct, like, laws that are designed and intending to discriminate and cause prejudice. So that's what I would call actual institutionalized racism. That it's not. So I mean, I make a distinction which is maybe doesn't a semantic distinction which maybe doesn't other people don't recognize, because they use these things interchangeably, because everything simply is an example of systemic racism. If you believe in systemic racism, it just sort of bleeds into everything. But I would just make a distinction between institutionalized racism and systemic racism. And when things are actually institutionally racist, they have very clear and obvious ways in which they can be solved, basically. So if you'll just give me that semantic distinction, basically a system cannot be arbitrary in its discrimination, because it's a compounding confluence of so many activities and behaviors and things occurring that interpenetrate one another. Okay, so there is no way of calling a system arbitrary in its discrimination, because it effectively, the system is not discriminating. Like, I understand that on a level of statistical analysis, you can extract that by pumping in enough definitional assertions, you can get that reading out. From a top-down point of view. Now, to call a system arbitrary in its discrimination against people is to aggregate the system into a single narrative, into a total framework that is almost ascribed, ideologically speaking, it's infused with an intentionality. It's like a perpetrator. It's like a compound perpetrator. Whether that, it's not really important to the level to which people anthropomorphize, not saying that word correctly, that feature or not, it doesn't really matter. But to me, it's problematic no matter how sort of mythologically you interpret it or intellectually you take it, because it is a compounded variable of many different things happening. And this, I think, is fundamentally, to actually fix this, you're going to have a level of concentration of power and centralization and bureaucracy. You're going to have to bureaucratize everything in order to try to fix that problem, if that is your solution to that problem. which will fundamentally break down everything, and it will also have to impose a kind of orthodoxy of interpretation and analysis. So you'll literally have to break down a liberal democratic society in order to perpetrate the solution to that problem, in order to counter the system's arbitrariness. You have to replace the arbitrariness with control of everything. So you have to have a control system. Okay. But anyway, the that compound variable is generally what actually translates into that gray area, in terms of how people are identity entities are designated. So that's what creates the kind of the strange wiggle room as to how some people sort of don't fall directly into the stereotype into which the whole causal narrative clearly seems to come into effect. But it also forces you to believe that the only way to fix a disadvantage is to undo the causal property that is described by the historical interpretation of cause, and not by, let's say, the present and future orientated interpretation of cause, where we define the cause of a disadvantage to be a missing solution. And so the general response to the criticism of the narrative of identity consciousness is merely just to talk about the past, because it's obvious that the past has some kind of deterministic relationship to the present. Now, it's interesting because technically, and this also comes against science. You know, the scientific sort of assumption that something is as real or has at least a scientific truth based on its predictive value. You know, that's almost the fundamental claim that science makes, that it conflates truth with predictive value, when it's quite ironic that science has already been debunked by itself, in that there is no predictive force in the universe. It does not exist. We know that fundamentally. Science has proven the opposite, that although there might be things which we could say are elements of a predictive force, those elements are always compounded with some level of uncertainty. So as far as we know, there's no such thing as a predictive value. It's just like a completely synthetic model. And to the level to which we can ascribe predictive values, all we're in fact doing is generating approximate accounts. And it's funny because identity politics, or identity consciousness itself, or the fight against systemic racism, is fundamentally one of those things. It's an approximate sort of reduction that kind of is good enough, but you can't inspect it a bit too much. I mean, the worst, well, I mean, not the worst, but another way of looking at it is that arbitrary discrimination by a system overlooks the fact that a system is a compound variable. And then you want to derive from that compound variable a kind of a neat sort of entity, some kind of statistical entity or generalized sort of group of people that has to be sort of fudged and fuzzily, kind of demarcated as deserving of a distinct moral consideration. And that moral consideration effectively gets inherited from the evil that exists in history, so that these people were commonly, when I say commonly, I mean they were collectively targeted by some evil, which becomes a kind of the conditioning that was done to them. And so that becomes their binding factor, basically. So as much as they share in that causal conditioning, um, they all suffer from a loss of agency, and from that loss of agency, um, if they target not uh, the interpretation of the cause of their disadvantage as being a solution to the disadvantage, but they want to target um, the causal narrative as in the historical account, then they have to reinforce and redeem the thing that was historically how it was historically perpetrated. And so it's a strange kind of reliving of history. Um, Now, the Constitution is very clear that you were allowed to create special policy to address groups of disadvantaged persons. Now, it's persons that is the emphasis in the equality clause, not groups. The only reason why groups are mentioned is because obviously policy has to be designed for a particular purpose to target a particular disadvantage. And so, you have to make a way for applicants to know if they qualify or not. And it says that these policies will be effectively immune from uh, claims of unfair discrimination. Now, that doesn't mean that they're allowed to perpetrate direct unfair discrimination. It means that they're safe from being non-inclusive. They don't have to include the whole population. They can just include that particular group that has a particular solution to a particular disadvantage. And so there is a facility within the equality clause to specifically address, to enable government to create specific solutions. Instead, what government has done is it's actually created a kind of ideological zoo, is all you can call it, to really unleash the demons. And because all of this ideology is incredibly toxic. It empowers the worst individuals. It sort of creates this narcissism around a kind of narcissistic hurt, and it actually promotes a kind of agonized um, excavation of history, and it really inspires a kind of diametrically instigated revenge. It's just and it also has a kind of morality which you can only call proto-fascistic, and which will eventually evolve into full-blown fascism. There's no getting around it. This ideology has a very clear track. It has a very clear. Already, it says that truth itself and reason itself is fundamentally white supremacist. Everything becomes essentially, if you're not promoting the resolution of the causal narrative, then you are part of the problem, basically. Okay, let me try and have a more centered discussion on these issues. It is very problematic talking about identity consciousness or uh, the argument or the complaint of systemic racism, because it doesn't have a viable, coherent belief structure. Um, it doesn't. Uh, it doesn't do a lot of things, and so you're sort of, you're kind of punching or boxing with a phantom, because you have to you talk about something, you get into the subject matter, and then the subject matter involves other subject matter which are all somewhat related and is talked about within the realm of identity consciousness and arguments and also supposed critiques against systemic racism. And you want to treat all these, you don't want to look like that you're overlooking these things, and so it looks quite embarrassing to sort of talk about these issues because they have these long chains of subject matter which are rather convoluted, and you can't really systematically address it because the belief structure itself is fundamentally untenable. It doesn't actually, the complaint of systemic racism doesn't hold any fundamental water. Um, but it does, or under its umbrella, there are issues there that do have to be addressed. It's just that trying to address them by tackling systemic racism is just, it's it is fundamentally problematic. So it is very troubling to sort of deal with it. So I mean, yeah, it's easier when sort of discussing it, I guess. Than to actually try to make a lecture about it, and to have a sort of dialogue. Although, not, as I've described before, it's not really possible to have a dialogue with proponents of identity consciousness. Uh, because they are immediately concerned with the causal narrative which everything can be reduced to representing in the present, so that they are faced with an ongoing and immediate problem which everything is a kind of symbolic factor within. And so everything you say is automatically being reduced into falling into the category of well, the core of the complaint, you know, whatever you want to call it, perpetuating systemic racism. So I guess, yeah, to try and get another crack at getting into the philosophical fundamental error that is going on. So I guess cause itself might be a good place to start. So there is this kind of presumption that okay, let me not say that rather. So the issue of cause, let me refer to it like that, has within it sort of the issue of moral causation, which then has a kind of almost like a legal theory of causation. Um, that emerge from, you know, so it's interesting because there is a kind of positivistic drive within identity consciousness, or critiques against systemic racism, that all effectively come from the deprivation of agency. So because the system conditions people to have a loss of agency, no, that's not the left that I wanted. Okay, well, I guess this is just going to be rough notes then. Let me just read some of this stuff, I guess. The narrative relies on deprivation of agency to get itself off the ground. Social justice in this context, the context of complaints like systemic racism, are all dependent on their definitions of evil. Systemic racism is defined into reality, and its premises are not taken in the round. They are not re-examined at any point, as fundamentally this creed is not argued, it's merely asserted. And historical accounts are taken to be interchangeable with the notion of reality. Indeed, they are historical accounts are even more real than the present, as they represent as they as the present is merely some conduit of their apparition, and therefore also the medium of their so-called deconstruction. So the present has to be used to deconstruct the historical account of oppression, basically. Because, and I mean, I just call that the causal narrative, or the principle that there is a causal narrative that everything can be reduced to. This is problematic for so many different ways because to have such a causal narrative, you're going to have the stereotype of a deprived agency, and that has to be invoked. And the purpose of invoking this is merely to transfer this condition in order to solve by equilibrium the disparity between historically defined groups. So you end up projecting the history onto the present. And this is a fragile formulation of justice. It's hard to get people to go along with this program. It will require an orthodoxy of a persistent reduction into a causal narrative represented by a canonized history. So no one is allowed to disagree that history causes these effects, effectively. Which is almost like it's a kind of a positivistic legal sort of it's weird because it's almost like you can see this in the Nazi legal culture, that sort of by a kind of consensus or agreement, people can't argue against the orthodoxy. That somewhat by enough agreement we can just sort of agree what's real about truth and the present and how it relates to the past. There's no allowance for kind of dissent on these points because they are, inverted commas, insensitive or something like that, racially insensitive. They are damaging. Anyway, I'm going to go into the explanation of that. Okay, so that the canonized history, which must be morally charged as evil, as without this moral qualification, there is no moral authority that can be projected onto the present. Thus, history is mythologized as a narcissistic injury to identity instead of a morally neutral ulterior account of cause and effect. So it becomes a positivistic kernel of an indictment citing a legal theory of justice that binds historical cause into systemic perpetrating of an aggregated truth, which implicitly compels political movement on behalf of that truth, who will take upon themselves the burden of administering a historically informed justice within the system in order to displace arbitrary discrimination that the system is ascribed as dishing out, with whatever requisite controls and mediations, by an orthodoxy of ascribed representation and tokenism that relates to the causal narrative. So basically, the reason why you go on about the past is because you actually need an account of evil so that you can be good by counteracting it. So effectively, the solution is just the counter-narrative to the problem, which is the kind of the inherited narrative. So which is taken to be the prime cause. So the inherited narrative must also be the prime cause, which means that the most distinguishing mark that makes an entity a kind of a distinct entity deserving of its own distinct moral consideration and treatment is its loss of agency, effectively. And because when you excavate that historical image, because it's not, you can't change history, right? So the only point of getting that image clearly in everyone's minds is because you can't change history, is not to distinguish it, it's to discharge it, it's to reverse it, it's to turn it upside down. And then effectively you have to just find the right addresses of the right people so that you can do that transfer, that you can kind of have a repossession of agency, effectively. And so that's fundamentally problematic, is because in some total sense the system is a collection of everyone's agency. So in some like abstract sense, technically the ideology functions, because you can say that, yeah, as the narrative of a society or of any condition, that the important part that has precipitated whatever effect has occurred is just the aggregate of everyone's agency. And because we know that history is evil, then we need um, effectively some kind of adjudication over that agency, which just means that we need to freeze everyone's sort of tether and link to that historical account. So the historical account really has to become the most distinguishing feature about an individual. It has to about, so you don't have, you kind of have the sort of the mark of the beast almost, sort of imprinted as a mark of the conditioning of the system, and we just merely need to counteract. So the people that have been marked in the past um, need everyone else to be marked uh, at the inverse that they were marked. It's it's I mean, it's a, in some sense it's a rationally compelling sort of formulation of justice, because it has this, in some abstract terms it's very clear about what it wants, but the problem is that when you actually have to relate it to people on the ground, real human beings, the whole thing completely fractures, the whole thing completely falls apart. In fact, you can only start to make any headway with any of this stuff is if people, you have a proliferation of identity consciousness, you have like a real like a sort of a racial imagination on steroids, and so that's what has been precipitated by this very evil ideological system. And yeah, this is also a problem, is that the idea that a system can be racist, even that a system can be conferring disadvantage. I think it's much more clear when you look at this issue to actually just look at disadvantage. Don't look at disadvantage and advantage. Just look at disadvantage. To say that a system is generating disadvantage. I mean, if anything, that's what we should be focused on curing. But yeah, to say that a system is responsible, and which is somewhat a compound variable of many different things, agency included. And yes, they will also have within its umbrella the deprivation of agency, things about history, things about the present, things that are thought about the present and the future. All these things uh, are actually all factors, but reducing them all into essentially the deprivation of agency becomes both the cause of disadvantage and advantage. It's very strange. So you've got an oversimplified reduction and explanation of everything that happens. So that means you've got one carrot which is also the stick to solve everything, And this is the problem: is that the totalitarian sort of narrative, that the totalizing aggregate of putting everything into identity, which in some abstract sense you can do, and it's true on a statistical level. You can always draw statistics to show that the analysis is correct. But you see, that's all irrelevant because people are not statistics, and they're also not representations of statistics. People are not that. I mean, I, there's probably a mathematical proof for this as well, but I mean, it's actually morally putrid that people think that you can actually validly do this. I mean, some people might statistically belong only to one dimension that is relevant on the level of advantage and disadvantage, where others might uh, have many different sort of convoluted camps and identities and features about them and historical components. I mean, that complexity is almost insoluble. The idea that you're going to have something that administers over all of that, and that the system itself needs to take responsibility for all of these things. I mean, the centralization, the top-down administration and bureaucracy, and just the moral calculus of that is fascism. That is not, that is a Führer. You're asking for a savior to come and save identities or something like that. And this is exactly this was the same ideology of Nuremberg, of the Nuremberg dissatisfaction marches. They call them dissatisfaction marches because people could agree that they were not satisfied and they just wanted social justice delivered to them directly. They didn't want the accountability of a democracy. So, I mean, you can call this the breakdown of liberal democracy. I mean, well, this ideology certainly is the epitome of that. Because as soon as you have something like system responsibility, you have to have some kind of dictatorial concentration of power in order to sort of mediate between whatever factions there are, and that is also impossible. You can't actually get justice for any more than one identity. It's not possible because they have counter demands and requisites. It only works so much as you have a single point of extraction. You have a single point of evil. And that really is also the source of all the stereotypes and because that evil effectively becomes challenging and opposing that evil and turning that evil upside down. That is the in some sense, that is the only certainty provided for in the system, and everything merely flows as a consequence of that sort of prime act. And so that also means that the narrative therefore gets out of having to justify itself positively, because it has a negative inheritance that it has to just merely reconcile by basically having by giving itself the license to produce a set of conditions which correspond inversely to that initial loss of agency, which is taken to be a kind of a persistent conditioning that is systemically being generated. And so, I mean, just the notion of the system has within it the conflation of the present and the past. So basically, there's no forgiveness, could be another, thing that sort of attaches to this. Because this is a kind of legal theory that is doing some kind of cold calculation and looking at statistics. And the problem with that is that it's taking into account everything that's going on in the system, which is not merely issues of the past. It's also other things. It's things that are I mean, you could say reason itself is completely overlooked, as to how things function themselves. So there's no positive definition about what is lacking. It's a negative definition of what needs to be made up for. And that is all historical. And so what is being counteracted is history, it's not the present. And you only know that you've stopped that you've done enough of the counteraction when the outcome is even. So it's very strange because it's dislocated from its own what's the word that means product. So it's the product of its social justice is dislocated from the mechanism of its action, which is working on history and excavating that picture of evil so that the evil can be turned upside down, which is the sort of the panacea to the systemic oppression. So, and within that mismatch, there is a whole amount of representation and tokenism and ascribing, people these historical roles. In order to redress these abstract entities, these statistical entities. And there's a lot of havoc, and there's a lot of bad faith that goes into what statistics can actually be taken to mean. And this is plagued on in the worst way possible. So much so that you can, statistics don't tell you how to change those statistics. It would just be like one obvious sort of thing. And the assumption that statistics are generated by just the past, they are the effect from a past. What does the past involve? It involves many things. As I said as well, they involve beliefs about the present and the future, ideas about the present and the future, about morality, about how things work, how things function. So all of these things just get reduced somehow into just identity. I did want to also specifically make the point, although this seems actually a bit abstract or slightly off topic, because this came in the context that I was talking to someone arguing against the accusation that veganism is a white supremacist sort of Trojan horse or something like that. I guess I don't actually want to talk about that specifically, but I guess all I'll say is that the argument against systemic racism is very idealistic. It's incredibly idealistic. Um, and it has a very mechanical reduction assumed and asserted. I mean, it's so toxic. I mean, yeah, I don't even want to make all the complaints that because it's just you can't even you can't describe just how awful an idea that it is. You can't do that enough. Um, Let me. I said I was going to make some concessions, so yeah, because all these issues get much more convoluted and confusing. So I would just make a distinction that uh, my argument against systemic racism is not the same. How I debunk systemic racism is that's not the same as actual overt blatant racism. Uh, Especially blatant racism that is baked into law, that is specifically discriminatory. Um, so, like unfair discrimination, uh, direct, directly directed unfair discrimination, in the wording of the law, not by indirect interpretation of the law, but by the direct um, but obviously unfair discrimination is very easy to identify and to remove. Um, and then it doesn't exist anymore, and then you're only left with perhaps the problems of systemic racism. Now, there there are ways in which the past has greatly contributed towards uh, statistical or whatever, however you want to describe it. Although I think it's rather impersonal just to call it statistical Im- imbalances. Like I mean, like what does so comparatively, some people are doing worse than others. You know, obviously the historical residue, and in South Africa, it's not that remote. It's quite immediate. It's within living memory, quite stark. Um, the devastation put into people, um, and the sort of the disruption caused. These things they can obviously be correlated to disadvantages. Now, we are allowed within the Constitution and within the ambit of the law to have special dispensations given to people, uh, to seek to address those disadvantages. And it's very important that they actually be special dispensations rather than just blanket group sort of some kind of weird tokenism, that doesn't even address the specific disadvantage. Which I would generally say that would be um, representative. I shouldn't use that word so often. That would be um, that would symbolize a government that was out of touch with actually the task of uh, reconciling the history of this country. And the point of addressing disadvantages is actually to make some inroads into providing a solution to those disadvantages. But the idea that the disadvantage must, at any cost, at any means, be attempted in order just to provide some, that the whole system must be brought to its knees and everything must be somewhat renewed in some kind of political crucible, at the cost of institutional stability, at the cost of the growth of the economy, at the cost of having a developing economy function. We have already sabotaged a lot of things in this country in the name of effectively racialized legislation, giving blanket ascriptions of effectively defining people as disadvantaged rather than providing specific dispensations for specific disadvantages, effectively by a lazy government that is probably not even that concerned with actually fixing this legacy, because it's not on them, effectively, because they are loving this race card. They are playing this race card very successfully because it doesn't fall on their heads, and in fact it becomes the political rhetoric which allows them to influence more of the economy, to centralize more of the economy, to make more resources under the capture of what you can only call a despondent and corrupt political caste of controllers and opportunists, to say the least. But what is even more despicable is this intellectual atmosphere, or this academic validation of the kind of ideology which allows this opportunism to be concealed and to be effectively part of this slow march towards a kind of furor politics, which is really framing and devastating political discourse in South Africa. Even the official opposition, the largest opposition party, has embraced black consciousness. The leader embraces his black identity publicly. Very good politicians like Gwen Ngwenya have left his party because they can't tolerate that kind of racialist nonsense, basically. As we have the slow decline of everyone moving towards the rhetoric of what is effectively the black reincarnation of Hitler, Julius Malema, and the monstrous people who support him and his political vision of this really quite putrid, self-agonizing, sort of false prophecy that the more they fail, somehow the more self-righteous it proves the ideology. It proves that they need to be more radical the more that they fail. You know, it's a very easy form of radical activism because there's no accountability that falls on your side of the fence effectively, and you're just calling for someone to come in and take a kind of collective responsibility for the entire system. So we live in basically almost the reincarnation of Weimar Germany today. We've got these race and gender studies infesting the academia, and has penetrated the education system. You have teachers pushing this stuff on children, poisoning their minds with anti-constitutional values. People forget that in Weimar Germany, before the Nazis took over, they were teaching Aryan studies in high school. And we have that same ilk of pseudo-intellectualism, just they don't talk about biology, they effectively talk about it via this kind of esoteric identification with history, what I call the causal narrative. So, they might not believe in the superiority of their genetics, but they certainly believe in the moral superiority of their causal narrative. As they do so with public money. Because there's not much more can be said about such a depressing topic.